As the train screeched to a halt at Green River, Wyoming in the summer of 1876, Katherine James clutched her small leather satchel tightly to her chest, her heart hammering with both hope and dread. The journey west had been her last resort, a final attempt to escape the whispers and stares that had followed her all her life back in Boston. Here, in this dusty frontier town, perhaps she could begin anew, though the familiar knot of anxiety reminded her that new faces didn't mean new acceptance. Catherine Katy, to the few who had ever shown her kindness, stepped down from the train, her ankle-length skirt catching momentarily on the metal step. The late afternoon sun beat down mercilessly, causing beads of sweat to form along her brow. She was acutely aware of her appearance, her awkward, gangly frame, the unfortunate arrangement of her features, and the birthmark that spread across her left cheek like spilled wine. A marked woman, her mother had sometimes said with a sigh when she thought Catherine couldn't hear. The platform was alive with activity reuniting families, cowboys loading supplies and merchants hawking their wares. Catherine kept her head down, hiding her face beneath the wide brim of her bonnet as she made her way through the crowd. She had arranged to meet her aunt's friend, Mrs. Peterson, who had agreed to provide her with lodging until she found employment. "Miss James," a voice called out, and Catherine lifted her gaze to meet the curious eyes of a plump woman in her 50s. "I'm Martha Peterson. Goodness, you look nothing like your aunt described." Catherine felt the familiar sting of disappointment in the woman's voice. "Yes, I'm Katherine James. Thank you for meeting me, Mrs. Peterson." The older woman's smile tightened as she took in Catherine's full appearance. "Well then, come along. I've got a room ready, though I must warn you it's modest. I run a respectable boarding house, and I expect all my tenants to contribute to its upkeep." As they walked through the dusty main street of Green River, Catherine absorbed her surroundings: the wooden boardwalks, the saloon with its swinging doors, the general store displaying wares from the East, and the varied faces of frontier life. Some glanced her way, their expressions shifting from curiosity to something else when they caught sight of her features. She had hoped things might be different here, but people's reactions seemed depressingly familiar. Mrs. Peterson's boarding house stood on the edge of town, a two-story structure painted a faded blue with white trim. "I'll show you to your room," Mrs. Peterson said, leading Catherine up a narrow staircase. "Breakfast is at 6, supper at 6 in the evening. I've mentioned to Mr. Daniels at the general store that you might be looking for work." The room was indeed modest: a single bed with a thin mattress, a washstand with a cracked mirror, which Catherine immediately turned to face the wall, and a small chest of drawers. But it was clean, and it was hers. "Thank you," Catherine said softly. "I'll visit Mr. Daniels first thing tomorrow." Mrs. Peterson lingered in the doorway, her eyes assessing. "Your aunt said you were good with numbers and had worked in your father's shop." "Yes, I kept the books and helped customers." "Well, that might serve you here. Green River may be growing, but it's still small enough that word travels fast. Just try to make a good impression." The implied message was clear: try not to let your face be the first thing people notice. Catherine nodded, her throat tight. "I understand." After Mrs. Peterson left, Catherine sank onto the bed, exhaustion from the journey washing over her. She had spent her entire 22 years of life being judged for her appearance, enduring countless rejections from potential suitors, employers, and even supposed friends. Her parents had loved her, but even they had occasionally betrayed their disappointment that their only daughter hadn't been blessed with beauty. When both had succumbed to influenza last winter, leaving their modest estate to cover outstanding debts, Catherine had made the decision to start fresh somewhere far away. Her aunt in New York had suggested the West a place where, perhaps, a woman might be valued for more than her looks. Now, as the day's last light filtered through the thin curtains, Katherine allowed herself a moment of doubt. Had she made a terrible mistake in coming here? Morning arrived with the sounds of movement downstairs. Katherine dressed carefully in her second-best dress, a navy blue cotton with a high collar that she hoped would draw attention away from her face. She pinned her mousy brown hair into a tight bun and, avoiding the mirror, prepared to face her first day in Green River. Breakfast was a quiet affair. The other boarders, two older men who worked at the railroad station, and a young widow who taught at the local school, regarded Katherine with polite curiosity but little warmth. The widow, Mrs. Collins, was particularly beautiful, with golden hair and delicate features that made Katherine feel even more ungainly by comparison. "Are you seeking employment, Miss James?" Mrs. Collins asked, buttering a piece of toast. "Yes, I hope to find work at the general store." Mrs. Collins exchanged a glance with Mrs. Peterson. "Mr. Daniels can be particular about who works the front of his store, but I'm sure you'll find something suitable." The gentle pity in her voice told Katherine everything she needed to know. The general store occupied a prominent position on Main Street. A bell jingled as Katherine entered, and a balding man with spectacles looked up from behind the counter. "Mr. Daniels, I'm Katherine James. Mrs. Peterson mentioned you might have a position available." Mr. Daniels' eyes widened slightly as they took in her face, then quickly shifted away. "Ah, yes. Mrs. Peterson sent word. I'm afraid the position I had open was for someone to work with customers, and he cleared his throat awkwardly. "I've just filled it yesterday." It was a lie, and they both knew it. Katherine had endured enough rejections to recognize the signs. "Perhaps there might be work in the storeroom. I'm quite organized and good with inventory." Mr. Daniels hesitated, then nodded. "I suppose I could use help with the books and stock." "The pay would be less, of course." "Of course." Katherine managed a small smile. "When would you like me to start?" "Tomorrow morning, 7 o'clock sharp." He seemed relieved that she hadn't protested the reduced wages or hidden position. The next 2 weeks fell into a pattern. Katherine would arrive at the store before anyone else, work diligently in the back room organizing inventory and keeping the accounts, and leave after the last customer had gone. Mr. Daniels seemed pleased with her work, but made it clear she was to remain out of sight when possible. On the rare occasions she had to enter the main store, she could feel the customers' eyes on her, hear their whispered comments. At the boarding house, things weren't much better. Mrs. Peterson was cordial but distant, and the other boarders largely ignored her. Only Mrs. Collins made occasional efforts at conversation, though these often felt more like charity than genuine interest. One evening, as Katherine sat alone on the back porch watching the sunset, Mrs. Collins joined her. "You're from Boston, I understand," she asked, settling her skirts around her. "Yes." "It must be quite an adjustment coming to a place like this." Katherine nodded. "It's different, but I'm adapting." Mrs. Collins studied her for a moment. "You know, there's to be a social at the church this Saturday. Music, dancing, food. You should come." The invitation surprised Katherine. "I'm not sure I'd be welcome." "Nonsense. Everyone is welcome at church functions." Mrs. Collins patted her hand. "Besides, there are many unmarried men in these parts. Some might be willing to overlook certain challenges for a woman who can cook and keep house." The words stung, though Katherine knew they were meant kindly. "Thank you, but I didn't come west to find a husband willing to overlook my appearance." Mrs. Collins looked taken aback. "I know what you meant," Katherine said softly, "and I appreciate your thoughtfulness. Perhaps I will attend, after all." Saturday arrived, and Katherine dressed with care in her best dress of forest green with modest lace at the collar and cuffs. She had debated wearing her bonnet to partially shield her face, but decided against it. If she was to make this town her home, she would have to face its people sooner or later. The church social was held in the meadow behind the white clapboard building. Tables laden with food lined one side, while a small group of musicians played lively tunes. Couples danced on a wooden platform and children ran about playing games. Katherine stood at the edge of the gathering, watching. "Miss James, you came." Mrs. Collins approached, accompanied by a young man with sandy hair and eager eyes. "This is Mr. Thompson, who runs the print shop. He was just saying he'd like to meet the new arrivals in town." Mr. Thompson's smile faltered visibly when he got a clear look at Katherine's face. "Miss James," he said stiffly, tipping his hat, "if you'll excuse me, I see Sheriff Miller wants a word." He retreated quickly. Mrs. Collins had the grace to look embarrassed. "I'm sorry, he's usually more mannerly than that." "Please, don't concern yourself," Katherine said, her voice steady despite the familiar humiliation. "I think I'll get some punch." As she made her way to the refreshment table, Katherine overheard snippets of conversation. "That new girl at Daniel's store. Face like that, poor thing. Should keep to herself." Really, she kept her chin up, determined not to show how deeply the words cut. As she reached for the ladle, a man's voice behind her said, "Careful, that punch packs quite a kick. Reverend Smith isn't looking, so I think someone's added a little something extra." Katherine turned to find herself looking up at a tall man with dark hair and eyes the color of a summer sky. Ethan Gray was what one might call ruggedly handsome, with a strong jaw shadowed with stubble and laugh lines around his eyes. He wore the practical clothes of a working cowboy: denim pants, a faded blue shirt, and a leather vest. His hat was pushed back on his head, revealing a lock of hair that fell across his forehead. For a moment, he seemed startled by her appearance, but then his smile returned, unwavering. "I'm Ethan Gray. Run a small ranch about 5 miles outside town." Katherine braced herself for the usual quick retreat. "Katherine James, I work at the general store, in the back, right? I've seen you through the storeroom door when I pick up supplies." He poured himself a cup of punch. "You're new to Green River." "Yes, about 2 weeks now." "And how do you find it?" The unexpected continuation of conversation threw Katherine off balance. "It's different from Boston." Ethan laughed, a warm sound that seemed to wrap around her. "I expect so. Fewer fancy buildings, more dirt and cattle." Despite herself, Katherine smiled. "Precisely." "So, Miss James, do you dance?" Her smile faded. "I know I don't. That is, I know how, but I don't usually." "That's a shame," he said, seeming genuinely disappointed. "Though I can't say I'm much of a dancer myself. Last time I tried, I stepped on poor Mrs. Wilson's foot so badly she limped for a week." Katherine couldn't help but laugh at the image. "Then perhaps we're both better off here by the punch bowl." "Maybe so." His eyes held hers, showing none of the discomfort or pity she was accustomed to seeing. "Tell me about Boston." For the next hour, they talked about Boston and Wyoming, about books. He was surprisingly well-read for a cowboy, about the changing frontier. Not once did he mention her appearance or act as though speaking with her was an act of charity. When he finally excused himself to speak with the blacksmith about some horseshoes he'd ordered, Katherine felt lighter than she had in years. "I see you met Ethan Gray," Mrs. Collins said, appearing at Katherine's side with poorly disguised curiosity. "Yes, he was very kind." Mrs. Collins nodded. "He's a good man. Keeps to himself mostly. Runs that small ranch of his with just a couple of hands. Lost his wife and child to fever about 5 years back." "How terrible," Katherine murmured, thinking of the laugh lines around his eyes that suggested a man who had known joy despite sorrow. Yes, he was devoted to her. Beautiful woman Margaret was, golden hair, perfect complexion. Mrs. Collins sighed. Some thought he might court the blacksmith's daughter last year, pretty girl, sweet disposition, but nothing came of it. The implication was clear. A man who had once had a beautiful wife would hardly look twice at someone like Katherine. She felt the brief bubble of happiness deflate. "It's getting late," Katherine said. "I think I'll head back to the boarding house." As she walked back alone, the stars emerging in the darkening sky, Katherine scolded herself for allowing hope to flicker, even momentarily. Men like Ethan Gray didn't court women like her. One pleasant conversation didn't change the reality she had known all her life. The following Tuesday, Katherine was deep in concentration, reconciling the store's accounts when the storeroom door opened. She looked up, expecting Mr. Daniels, but instead found Ethan Gray filling the doorway. "Miss James," he said, removing his hat. "Hope I'm not disturbing you." "Mr. Gray," she said, quickly smoothing her hair. "Mr. Daniels isn't here at the moment if you need him. Actually, I was hoping to speak with you." He stepped into the room, closing the door partway behind him. "I enjoyed our conversation at the social." "As did I," she admitted cautiously. "I was wondering if you might like to join me for dinner at the hotel restaurant this Friday evening." He spoke matter-of-factly, as though asking a perfectly ordinary question. Katherine stared at him, certain she had misheard. "Dinner with me?" A smile tugged at his lips. "Yes, with you, unless you're otherwise engaged." "No, I'm not engaged, that is, I'm not busy." She felt heat rising to her cheeks. "Mr. Gray, I'm not sure you—" "Ethan, please. Ethan, I'm not sure you understand. People will talk if you're seen dining with me." His expression sobered. "I'm well aware of how small towns work, Miss James. I'm asking anyway." "Why?" The question escaped before she could stop it. He considered her for a long moment. "Because I'd like to know you better. Is that reason enough?" It wasn't, not really. Experience had taught Katherine that men who showed interest in her usually had ulterior motives, a cruel joke, a bet with friends, or desperate loneliness. But something in Ethan's direct gaze made her want to believe him. "Yes," she said finally. "I would like to have dinner with you." His smile returned, warming his eyes. "Excellent. I'll call for you at the boarding house at 6. After he left, Katherine sat motionless, her heart racing. Was this a terrible mistake, or could Ethan Gray possibly be sincere? Friday evening arrived, and Katherine found herself facing the dreaded mirror as she prepared. The birthmark seemed especially vivid against her pale skin, her nose too prominent, her lips too thin. She had spent precious dollars on a pot of face powder, but it did little to conceal what nature had bestowed. Mrs. Peterson had been visibly shocked when Katherine mentioned her dinner plans. "With Ethan Gray? Are you certain?" The disbelief in her voice had been almost comical. At precisely 6 o'clock, a knock came at the front door. Katherine descended the stairs to find Ethan in the parlor, dressed in what were clearly his best clothes, a dark suit that fit his broad shoulders well, a crisp white shirt, and polished boots. He held his hat in his hands and stood when she entered. "Miss James," he said, and something in his gaze as it traveled over her made her feel for the first time that perhaps she wasn't so very unfortunate to look at after all. "Mr. Gray, Ethan," she corrected herself. "You look very nice." "As do you." He offered his arm. "Shall we?" The hotel restaurant was the finest establishment in Green River, with white tablecloths and oil lamps providing a warm glow. As they entered, Katherine felt every eye in the room turn toward them. The maitre d' hesitated briefly before showing them to a table. "Pay them no mind," Ethan said quietly as he held her chair. "They're just not used to seeing me in clean clothes." His attempt to ease her discomfort touched her. "Do you avoid civilization so thoroughly then?" "My ranch keeps me busy, and I've never been one for town gatherings. Present company has made me reconsider, though. Throughout dinner, Katherine waited for some sign that his interest was feigned or that he regretted his invitation, but none came. He spoke of his ranch, his dreams of expanding it, his childhood in Missouri. He asked about her life in Boston, her journey west, her hopes for the future. When she hesitantly mentioned her parents' deaths, he reached across the table and briefly covered her hand with his. "Losing those we love leaves a hole that never quite fills," he said, and she knew he was thinking of his wife and child. As they walked back to the boarding house under a sky brilliant with stars, Ethan offered his arm again. "I hope you enjoyed the evening." "Very much," she said truthfully. "Though I'm still not entirely sure why you asked me." He stopped walking and turned to face her. "Katherine," he said, the first time he'd used her given name, "I've spent 5 years alone, convinced that happiness wasn't meant for me again. Then I walked into Daniel's store last month and saw you through that doorway, completely absorbed in your work and something. Woke up. But I'm not," she gestured vaguely at her face. "Your wife was beautiful, Mrs. Collins told me." A shadow crossed his features. "Margaret was lovely, yes. She was also kind, intelligent, and stubborn as a mule when she set her mind to something." His voice softened. "But this isn't about Margaret. It's about you and me, and whether you might consider seeing me again." Katherine searched his face for any sign of deceit and found none. "Yes," she said finally. "I would like that." He smiled, and it transformed his face, crinkling the corners of his eyes. "Good. I'm delivering cattle to Cheyenne next week, but when I return, perhaps we could ride out to the ranch. I'd like to show it to you." At the boarding house door, he removed his hat and took her hand, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "Good night, Katherine." She watched him walk away, her hand tingling where his lips had touched. For the first time in her life, Katherine James dared to hope that someone might see beyond her face to the person within. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur. Katherine continued her work at the store, but now she moved with a new confidence. The whispers and stares continued, of course, but they seemed to matter less. News of her dinner with Ethan had spread through town like wildfire, prompting both increased curiosity and, from some quarters, undisguised disbelief. "I can't imagine what he sees in her," Katherine overheard Mrs. Wilson say to another woman at the store. "Perhaps he's desperate for a housekeeper," came the reply, followed by unkind laughter. Such comments stung, but Katherine found herself more resilient than before. When Ethan returned from Cheyenne, he called at the boarding house the very next day, bearing a small gift, a beautiful blue hair ribbon he'd purchased in the city. "It reminded me of your eyes," he said simply. Their ride to his ranch took place on a glorious autumn day, the aspen trees turning gold against the blue Wyoming sky. Ethan was a patient teacher, showing Katherine how to sit properly in the saddle of the gentle mare he'd brought for her. His hand lingered at her waist as he helped her mount, and the warmth of his touch stayed with her long after. The gray ranch was modest, but well-maintained, a solid log cabin with a wide porch, a barn, corral, and bunkhouse for the 2 hands he employed. Inside the cabin, Katherine was surprised by the touches of refinement, books lining shelves, a decent piano in one corner, curtains at the windows. "Margaret loved music," Ethan explained, noting her glance at the piano. "Do you play?" "A little," Katherine admitted. "My mother insisted on lessons." "Would you?" He gestured to the instrument. Hesitantly, she sat on the bench and began a simple melody, her fingers finding their way despite years of neglect. When she finished, she looked up to find Ethan watching her with an expression that made her breath catch. "You bring life back to this house," he said quietly. After showing her the rest of the ranch, they shared a picnic lunch by a small stream that ran through his property. The conversation flowed easily between them, punctuated by comfortable silences. As they prepared to return to town, Ethan took her hand. "Katherine, I want to be clear about my intentions. I'm not a young man looking for diversion. I'm 34 years old and I know my own mind. I'm courting you properly and seriously if you'll have me." Her heart seemed to stop, then race forward. "Why me?" she asked, needing to hear it plainly. "There are prettier women in Green River who would be honored by your attention." "I don't want a pretty face," he said firmly. "I want a partner. Someone intelligent, kind, and strong enough to face the challenges of ranch life. Someone who makes me laugh and think and feel alive again." He reached up to gently touch her cheek, his fingers brushing the birthmark she had spent a lifetime trying to hide. "And if you must know, I find you beautiful." Tears welled in her eyes. "No one has ever said that to me before." "Then no one has truly seen you," he replied simply. Their courtship progressed steadily over the next few months. Every Sunday, Ethan would escort Katherine to church, sit beside her during the service, and often join her for dinner afterward at the boarding house. They attended the Harvest Festival together, where Ethan proudly introduced her to neighboring ranchers as Miss Katherine James, "the woman I'm courting." They rode out to the ranch regularly, and Katherine began to imagine herself making a life there. Not everyone approved. Some townspeople whispered that Ethan must be marrying her for convenience, or perhaps for the modest savings she had from her work. Others suggested more cruelly that he had simply lowered his standards after years of loneliness. Katherine tried not to let such talk affect her, but occasionally doubt would creep in. "Are you sure about this?" she asked one evening as they sat on the boarding house porch. "About me." Ethan took her hand, his expression serious. "More sure than I've been about anything in a long time. The question is, are you sure about me? About ranch life? It's not easy, especially for a city-bred woman." "I'm stronger than I look," she said with a small smile, "and I've never felt more at home than I do at your ranch." As winter settled over Green River, bringing snow and bitter cold, Katherine found herself spending Christmas at the ranch for the first time. Ethan had invited her for the holiday, and Mrs. Peterson had given her permission to go, with the understanding that she would sleep in the main house, while Ethan stayed in the bunkhouse with his hands, a concession to propriety. They decorated a small pine tree with paper ornaments and strings of cranberries, roasted a goose, and exchanged modest gifts. As they sat before the fire that evening, Ethan took her hand. "I have one more gift," he said, reaching into his pocket. He withdrew a small ring, a simple gold band with a modest diamond. "It was my mother's. I've had it sized for you." Katherine stared at the ring, her heart pounding. "Ethan, I love you, Katherine James. I want to build a life with you, to wake up beside you every morning and fall asleep next to you every night. Will you marry me?" Tears spilled down her cheeks as she nodded. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I will marry you." He slipped the ring onto her finger, then drew her into his arms for a tender kiss, not their first, but perhaps their most meaningful. They were married on a bright January day in the Green River Church, with most of the town in attendance, some out of genuine goodwill, others from pure curiosity. Katherine wore a cream-colored dress she had sewn herself, with Ethan's blue ribbon woven into her hair. As she walked down the aisle to where he waited, his face alight with love, she felt truly beautiful for the first time in her life. The years that followed brought both joy and hardship. The ranch prospered under their joint management, Katherine's head, for figures complementing Ethan's practical knowledge. They expanded their herd, built a larger barn, and added 2 rooms to the cabin. When their son was born a year after their marriage, a sturdy boy they named James after Katherine's father, Their happiness seemed complete. A daughter followed 2 years later, and though the little girl inherited her mother's birthmark, Katherine vowed she would grow up knowing her worth wasn't measured by her appearance. Not all the challenges they faced were external. There were times when Katherine's old insecurities surfaced, when she caught a glimpse of herself in the mirror and wondered how Ethan could possibly find her attractive. On such occasions, he would take her face in his hands and kiss her thoroughly, until she was breathless and laughing. "See what you do to me, Mrs. Gray," he would say, pressing her hand to his heart. Beautiful inside and out. 10 years into their marriage, as they sat on their porch watching their children play, Ethan put his arm around her shoulders. "You ever regret it?" he asked. Coming west, marrying a dusty old cowboy, living so far from civilization, Katherine leaned into him, savoring his warmth. "Never. This is where I found myself, where I found you." She looked out at the land they had nurtured together, at their children strong, confident, and kind. "I spent so many years being the ugly duckling, always out of place. But here, with you, I finally found where I belong." Ethan pressed a kiss to her temple. "You were never an ugly duckling, Katie, just a swan among people too blind to see it." As the sun set over the Wyoming hills, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, Katherine Gray smiled. The journey had been long and often painful, but it had led her here to love, to family, to acceptance. In Ethan's eyes, she had always been beautiful. And gradually, over the years of being truly seen and valued, she had come to believe it herself.